Most of us knew from lockdown drills that the classroom doors were supposed to be closed, locked, and the lights turned off. Then we were supposed to sit on the ground in the back of the classroom. The problem was that our teacher was gone. We looked around at each other, unsure of what to do. Then someone spoke up and said, "Shall we close the door?" We decided that we would. I walked over, closed it, and then locked the door. Someone else turned out the lights. We all started talking to each other, wondering what exactly was going on. If our teacher came back, we would let him in, but he most likely had keys with him. We weren't hearing anything from the hallways, but whatever the problem was could have been from anywhere in the school. A few minutes went by and nothing happened. Then somebody tried opening the door, thinking it might be the teacher. I got up and walked over to it, but by the time I got there and looked out, nobody was there. I went back and sat down at my desk again. We were really confused in the classroom now. Less than a minute later, it sounded like we heard some shouting in the distance. Then someone tried opening our classroom door, followed by more knocking on it. I walked over once again and this time looked out the small window. It was the kid who had been in our class earlier, but left. He was yelling and asking to be let in. I was just about to open the door for him when I heard more shouting coming from down the hallway. I heard somebody say, "Police," and the kid ran away from the door down the hallway. For several minutes, we were as confused as ever, but the lockdown ended about 5 minutes later, and several police officers knocked on our door. We let them in, and they explained the situation to us. When our teacher, Mr. Sanders, had left to use the bathroom, the other student left the classroom to follow him. The student knocked the teacher unconscious by punching him from behind. A janitor heard the incident, and then the student ran, which sent the school into lockdown, and the police were called. I'm glad that I didn't let that student back into the classroom. Mr. Sanders ended up being okay, but he had to go to the hospital with a minor concussion. I'm not sure what that kid's problem with Mr. Sanders was exactly, but I did hear that he had been suspended earlier in the year for fighting. That was the only time I went to Saturday school. That's when his entire demeanor changed. Anger spread across his face as he stormed over to the waiting area, which was a room located between the ER and the front desk. As he walked away, I caught a glimpse of what he was dragging and quickly realized it was an axe. I panicked, but didn't want to raise any alarms. I almost called a code over the PA system, but instead opted to call the police on my cell phone. Then, I hurried down the hall to signal the nurses that we had a situation. The police would take about 20 minutes to arrive since they were coming from 2 towns over. We were all small women, and this man was tall and muscular. Even if we combined forces, we wouldn't stand a chance. I calmly walked back to the front desk and paged the doctor, asking him to call me, but I never received a response. Meanwhile, the man in the waiting area became increasingly agitated, eventually yelling and demanding help. I quickly hid from him. The nurses and I devised a plan to lock him in the waiting area. The glass was reinforced and the doors were heavy, so they should have held him there until the police arrived. The plan worked until the man realized what we had done. He started screaming, throwing chairs around the room, and then began using his axe on the door. We stood near the front desk, watching in terror. I've never been so scared in my life. He was actually making progress on the door. Just then, the emergency doctor returned from his break. He strolled in through the front entrance, still sipping on a drink. When he saw us huddled by the front desk, he immediately took charge of the situation. After gathering the necessary information, the doctor disappeared toward the back entrance, where the EMTs usually come in. He then unlocked one of the waiting room doors and tackled the man when he wasn't looking. The doctor bound the man's wrists with cable ties and sat on his back until the police arrived. I was so grateful to have a young, physically fit doctor with us that night. I bought him coffee every time our schedules crossed as a thank you, but I don't think that will ever be enough. After this second incident, while working the 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. shift, I decided to never work late shifts again. Now, I'm on a Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. schedule, and I feel much safer. Last August, I was admitted to the voluntary psychiatric ward at the local hospital due to severe anxiety and depression. Unfortunately, it was my second hospitalization, but this time I would be sharing a room with another patient. When the psychiatric unit was built, for some reason, they decided to design double rooms, which meant that high-functioning patients often had to share. Since I had been there just a month earlier, the nurses all remembered me. Stays in the psychiatric ward typically last about 1 to 2 weeks. And because this was the voluntary ward, there were no actively psychotic or violent patients. My roommate, Jane, seemed like a quiet and unassuming person. She was small in stature and didn't seem to pose any concern at first. One of her favorite activities was sitting at her desk, working on crossword puzzles, and it appeared to be the only thing she did while in the room. Each patient gets their own desk and dresser, and I was admitted around 6 p.m. By 9:30 p.m., I had taken my medication and began meditating before going to sleep. As I focused on a beautiful picture of a tree and fence mounted on the wall, I noticed myself slowing my breathing and calming down. Then, something strange caught my eye. There was writing on the picture, etched in pencil. It read, "They are all liars. Liars." There were a few other things written that I couldn't fully decipher, but it made me feel uneasy. I assumed that a previous patient must have written it, so I decided to inform the nurses about it. If you've ever been in a psychiatric ward, you know that most of the time it's extremely boring. I spent most days walking around the ward, and some patients would even count their laps. I learned that 30 laps equaled 1 mile. I also spent time in the art room painting with a group of patients. However, after some time, I noticed that Jane never attended any of the group activities. In fact, she rarely left the room. Every time I returned, she was always at her desk, working on the same crossword puzzle. At first, I thought it was just her way of coping with boredom, but then I realized something odd. The crossword puzzle never changed. It was always the same one, and no progress was being made. It reminded me of the scene from The Shining, where Jack writes the same sentence repeatedly. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. On the second night, I came back to the room around 10:30 p.m. to go to sleep. Jane was still sitting at her desk working on the same puzzle, and the lights were still on. By this point, she had stopped responding to me altogether when I said hello or asked if she was going to join the group. Perhaps she was reacting to her medication or just didn't feel like talking. I turned off my light and closed my privacy curtain. The medication I was on knocked me out fairly quickly, but at around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of a medical assistant asking Jane if she thought it was time to turn off the light or go to bed for the sake of her roommate. Jane didn't respond, and the lights stayed on. I just rolled over and went back to sleep. At some point, Jane must have turned off the light and gone to bed. But later, I woke up again, confused because my medication usually made me sleep for 12 hours straight. Then I heard someone talking. It was Jane repeating, "Jesse, help me. Jesse, help me." I asked her, "Jane, are you okay?" But she didn't respond. She just kept repeating the same words. At first, I thought she was talking in her sleep, but later, when I woke up again, she was saying it even louder. This time, I was sure she wasn't asleep. I tried to get her to respond, but she never acknowledged my presence. She just kept saying, "Jesse, help me. I need help." Not knowing what to do, I went to the night nurse, whose name was Jessie, and told her what was going on. When we returned to the room, Jane was hysterical, crying out for Jessie and trying to get out of bed. Jessie did her best to calm her down, and I was given more sedatives to help me get back to sleep. The next morning, Jane wasn't in the room, and a table that had been near her bed was now positioned in front of the bathroom curtain. When I went to use the bathroom, I discovered that an entire roll of toilet paper had been stuffed into the toilet. Once again, I went to find a nurse. As I stepped out into the hallway, I noticed two things. First, there was a medical assistant standing by the door near the front desk. Second, Jane was standing by the door as well. The door only opens when a call is made, so I was puzzled as to why someone needed to guard it. Later, I found out from another patient that Jane had spent the previous night running around the ward, throwing furniture. Security had been called to subdue her, and she had spent hours standing by the door like a statue. I went about my usual routine, painting and having breakfast. But later, I noticed Jane staring at me from outside the room. Whenever I looked up, she would quickly look away, but she wouldn't move from her spot for about 20 minutes. It made me uneasy, so I decided to return to the room. She followed me inside. At this point, I started to feel like things were getting out of hand. I informed the assistant at the front desk that I thought my roommate was following me around. While I was sitting with the assistant, Jane came over with 2 plastic bins full of my stuff, my iPad, my clothes, and even my pillowcase. I started to panic. The nurses were shocked. They said they had never seen anything like this before. I broke down in tears, and someone put an arm around me, saying, "It's going to be okay." To my horror, it was Jane. I asked her to stop touching me and asked the nurses to remove her from the area. Eventually, they moved me to a private meeting room and explained that Jane would be transferred to the involuntary ward later that day. Until then, I couldn't return to my room. While this was happening, Jane had moved to the back door leading to the stairwell, where she stood staring for hours. That evening, around 7 p.m., my husband came to visit, and we were playing cards with another patient. Jane was standing by the window, staring at me through the glass. I think she did it on purpose, so she could keep watching me. As we continued playing, 2 security guards and a psychiatrist arrived to move Jane upstairs. She refused to go, and when they tried to take her arm, she became violent, banging on the window and screaming for me to help her. They had to drag her upstairs, kicking and screaming. After that, I was assigned a new roommate, also named Jane, but she was very sweet and was only there to detox from medication. I felt much better after speaking with my psychiatrist, who reassured me that my reactions were completely normal. The next day, during our time in the garden, I saw my former roommate from the upstairs unit. I asked a supervisor if I could sit away from them during garden time, just to avoid her. She didn't approach me, but after we went back inside, she suddenly made a beeline for me, and once again had to be restrained. After that, I never saw her again. Something about me seemed to have triggered her, and I try not to think about what could have happened if she had remained my roommate. This is a story my mother told me when I was old enough to comprehend what almost happened to me. At the time, I was only a few weeks old, a vulnerable infant, oblivious to the world around me. It's strange to think how close I came to what could have been a life-altering event, one that still gives me chills whenever I hear it. Back in those days, it was common for midwives to visit a mother and her newborn at home after childbirth. My dad was out at work that day, as he usually was, and my mother had just put me down for a nap. Our home was peaceful and quiet, nestled in a small, close-knit community where crime was almost unheard of. Neighbors would be out working during the day, and the streets would fall into a sort of serene, deserted calm. Earlier that week, 2 midwives had visited our home, so when my mother heard a knock at the door, she was taken aback. She wasn't expecting anyone. Opening the door, she was greeted by a man and a woman, both wearing what seemed to be hospital uniforms and carrying identification badges. They introduced themselves politely, claiming they were from the hospital and had come to check on both my mother and me, her newborn daughter. My mother, seeing their professional appearance, didn't question them at first. After all, they knew her name, and they even knew I was a baby girl. Facts that made their visit seem all the more legitimate. The man informed my mother that he would go upstairs to check on me, while the woman would examine her downstairs. It was at that moment my mother's instincts kicked in. Something didn't feel right. She immediately told them that midwives had already visited earlier that week, and no one had informed her of another visit. She also mentioned that my father was due to come home soon, and he wouldn't be pleased about this unscheduled visit. The mood shifted quickly. The pair became defensive, their politeness melting into impatience. They insisted on their need to separate my mother from me, which only made her more suspicious. She was firm, saying she would call the hospital to confirm their visit. Her calm refusal to let them take me upstairs or separate us led to an uncomfortable back-and-forth exchange, but eventually they backed down. They adopted a more relaxed demeanor, saying there must have been a mistake, and began to leave. As they exited the house, something even more unsettling happened. My mother noticed a car parked outside, its engine running, with another person sitting in the driver's seat. It was as though they had planned an escape, ready to leave at a moment's notice. When my mother called the hospital, they confirmed her worst fears. No midwives were scheduled to visit that day, and they reassured her that it was against protocol to separate a mother and her newborn. What was even more alarming was the fact that the hospital did not have any male midwives on staff. The hospital urged her to contact the police immediately. Shaken, my mother called my father, who rushed home from work. Together, they reported the incident to the police, but as far as we know, nothing ever came of it. The identity and motives of those two strangers remain a mystery to this day. It's terrifying to think about what might have happened if my mother had trusted them, if she had let them into our home without question. They had clearly gathered enough information to know when my father wouldn't be home, and they even went so far as to acquire uniforms and badges to make themselves appear legitimate. But thanks to my mother's instincts, they didn't get the chance to carry out whatever sinister plan they had in mind. To this day, I shudder at the thought of what my life might have been like had my mother not followed her gut feeling that day. It's impossible to say what those two were truly after, but it's clear their intentions were far from innocent. We were incredibly lucky that they left when they did. Had they decided to use force, my mother would have been powerless to stop them. There's always a reason to be cautious, even in places that feel safe.